Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street in London in the United Kingdom. I want to talk today about the interview that Angela Rayner has given to Sky Television, where she gives an explanation for the scandal she's now been caught up in terms of paying tax in buying a property. It looks like she's underpaid tax, and this has become a massive political scandal. As a psychiatrist, I want to analyze the video from a psychiatric standpoint. There are a couple of very interesting things that happen. One of the things that journalists, perhaps particularly political journalists, have made a great deal of is the fact that Angela Rayner starts to cry, or appears at least tearful, or at least very emotional, around halfway into the interview. So from a psychiatric standpoint, when people start to cry, I have to tell you, and this may sound like a weird thing to say, that as a psychiatrist, on a daily basis, I see a lot of people crying in my consultations. I often say, actually, if people have had a consultation with me, particularly a first one, and they haven't cried, there's a sense in which we probably haven't talked about the most important thing that's bothering them. So I have a lot of clinical experience of people in extreme distress, and I want to help you think a little bit about your reaction to that, because sometimes crying is a manipulation. Was it a manipulation in the case of the Angela Rayner interview? Certainly after she became tearful, I do think the journalist, I think it was Beth Rigby, softens quite dramatically, it seems to me, in terms of her pursuit of Angela Rayner. So we'll talk a bit about how to evaluate extreme distress or crime. I'm going to use the Angela Rayner interview to help you think a bit about this predicament if ever you find yourself in it. The other reason I want to talk about it, and the theme of all my videos, is how can we learn from a national news event lessons that will help you navigate the hazards of life. Life is difficult. You need basic psychological skills in order to negotiate life successfully. And one skill is how to evaluate a story someone is telling you that explains away potentially immoral or bad behavior that paints them in a possibly bad light and may endanger your relationship with them. Let's take a classic example, although perhaps it's a bit sexist, but a woman, a wife or a girlfriend, finds some dodgy and flirty text messages or messages of some flirty description on her husband's or boyfriend's mobile phone. And she confronts him, and he comes up with a story. I'm not saying the story isn't true. And then she comes to consult with me because she's very anxious and worried. She's trying to evaluate the story. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to use the Angela Rayner interview because she uses some classic strategies. I'm not saying she's not telling the truth, but she certainly uses some classic psychological strategies to defend herself. And in evaluating the interview, I aim to help you evaluate a predicament you might find yourself in, which is you confront someone over some bad behavior and they come up with an explanation. In the case I've just given you, someone who's got some dodgy or flirty text messages comes up with an explanation. The woman then comes to see me, the wife or the girlfriend, and asks me, is the story true? How to evaluate the story. So I'm going to use the Angela Rayner interview to think about that. So one of the things that happens in the interview is that, let's go back to the moment where she starts to appear tearful. So this you might describe, if you're being cynical, as a gambit, okay? And certainly people crying is a gambit sometimes, not always. Sometimes they're genuinely overwhelmed by strong emotion. It tells you something about an internal state. But on other occasions, crying is about the audience. I have an audience. I'm crying. It's a piece of theatre or drama. And what I'm doing in crying is manipulating the audience. The manipulation is, go easy on me. I'm having a very bad time. And certainly in the journalistic interview on Sky Television, I believe that the journalists backed off quite a bit. So the message that crying sends, which is why it can be a manipulation, not saying it was on this occasion, is that the hidden message, or not so hidden message, is back off. Don't pursue me, because I could be having a nervous breakdown right in front of you. Given that most people who aren't professional psychologists or psychiatrists like myself don't want to have to deal with the can of worms that might be opened up by someone having a nervous breakdown, this can be quite an effective tactic. And I do believe that when she became tearful, the journalist backed off a bit on the interview. And it is interesting that certain websites, perhaps notably the Guardian newspaper and the BBC, have written about this tearing up moment in not an unpositive way, in quite a positive way. And I think Keir Starmer, who will be evaluating whether to hang on to Angela Rayner or not, will be thinking hard about that interview that she gave, and he'll be thinking hard about her ability to cope over the next few days with the press onslaught that's going to occur. Now, if the tears were genuine, in other words, she was genuinely so emotionally distressed that she lost control, even if momentarily, the other thing that Keir Starmer will be thinking about, and he may well bring in some clinicians to help him evaluate her, is she having a nervous breakdown? Is the stress of all this too much? Can she cope? If the crying sends a signal which is I'm barely coping, and yet there's more to come, this will influence someone like Keir Starmer. This is part of the chess game that's going on here in thinking about whether to hang on to her or not. And that may have very little to do with whether she was telling the truth or not. If he evaluates the interview as suggesting she can ride this thing out, she can control the interview, she's a master strategist and will survive this and is resilient, he may well hang on to her. I'm afraid today that politics is such a dirty game that the morality of whether what she did was right or wrong becomes irrelevant these days, unfortunately. It's about survival, basic political survival. So one of the reasons why the tearing up is significant politically and emotionally is it sending a signal that she's barely coping and then probably won't cope that well, and maybe he's going to have to get rid of her for that basic reason? Or is it a sign that actually she's a master tactician in complete control of the whole thing and is able to give an interview, is able to tear up, and people back off and don't come after her quite as much? They feel sorry for her. So that's one of the things in terms of the psychological significance of the tearing up bit. One of the reasons as a psychiatrist, when I'm dealing with people in severe emotional distress in a consultation, which is not an uncommon experience, I can't back off. They may start crying, and the message they may be used to sending, if it's a manipulation, is back off, leave me alone, don't, stop digging, stop probing. I can't do that as a clinician. I have a lot of experience of how to cope with people in great emotional distress, but a lot of journalists back off because they're not used to it, and they panic slightly, and they worry, am I inducing a nervous breakdown? I can't back off, and I have to stay with the client and keep with the subject that's causing them distress, though hopefully in a sympathetic and empathic and concerned manner. But I can't back off because maybe the client's suicidal, and I have to do an evaluation of how suicidal they are. I can't let them leave the clinic and then go away and perform some kind of suicidal act. So that's why the attitude of a clinician is going to be very difficult to the attitude of a journalist. The journalist has no responsibility, in a sense, if the client leaves and does something, and will be very concerned that they've entered psychopathological waters, so they'll be tiptoeing around someone who's crying, whereas to a clinician who's an expert, I don't mean to sound arrogant, and used to dealing with extreme emotional distress, we're more liable to hang in there with the client, because actually in the end that's the better way of bottoming out what's really going on and also assisting the client. I stay with the client when they're upset, and I say things like, you're looking very upset, I'm just wondering what it is that you're thinking about that's making you so upset. So you see, that's hopefully a gentle way of trying to stay with whatever's causing distress. With many journalists interviewing someone who starts to tear up, they actually subconsciously, unconsciously, or really quite consciously start to flee from continuing to probe that particular subject. That's why tearing up is such a powerful move in an interview or in a situation where someone's been confronted over wrongdoing. Now, if you go to think about this from a psychiatric standpoint, when does she start tearing up in the interview. This is hugely psychologically significant. The bit where she starts to tear up, you can look at the interview and decide for yourself, is the bit where the interviewer says, "Did you think about resigning?" I think the moment at which people get upset to that level is very important psychologically, and most people don't think about that because it's difficult for them to rewind in their mind the conversation. But as a psychiatrist, I'm interested, I will say to someone, when exactly in the conversation did the other person start to cry? Because that reveals a lot. The fact she started to tear up when she was asked not about her disabled child or her family or her ex, but about whether she thought about resigning, strongly suggests, I'm not saying this is the case, I'm just saying how a psychiatrist might think about this, or a psychologist, that she was feeling sorry for herself. The thing that caused most emotional distress was the prospect of not being deputy prime minister and the end of her political career. That, it would look like, was what really upset her. So there's the crying or the tearing up as a gambit. The second gambit we saw prominently deployed was the opening comment she gave in response to the first question from the journalist was something along the lines of, "This was quite a distressing time for my family." This is a very clever psychological maneuver. What this is saying between the lines, she used this gambit quite heavily throughout the interview. Again, I'm not saying it was done completely strategically. Maybe she was giving a genuinely heartfelt and emotional interview. But what she's trying to say is, don't view me as the Deputy Prime Minister. Don't view me as the Minister of Housing. View me as a mum. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why she kept invoking her family, if you wanted to be cynical about it. Throughout. And this is a classic strategy to invoke another way of thinking about someone that might invoke more sympathy. If we start thinking about Angela Rayner as a mum, we're going to be a lot more sympathetic than if we think about her purely as a deputy prime minister. So it's a clever gambit. I'm not saying it was a strategy, but I'm just explaining one way to think about people's stories when they come at you with a story, to think about why are they focusing on a particular role they have, which is mum, and not the other role, which is deputy prime minister and housing minister. They're trying to shape and change the way you think about them. Okay, so that was a very clever strategy, which was, "This has been quite a distressing time for my family," was the opening line, which is, "I'm a mum." Okay, so that's another thing that I think is going on very interestingly in the interview. Now, the basic explanation she gave, and I'm collapsing it down, so I'm being brutally simplistic here, and I know there'll be quibbles about this brutal simplicity, but it's quite a complicated story. If we collapse it down to its basic, simple, strategic elements, she hired cheap lawyers, and they gave a certain bit of advice. Then she hired a really expensive lawyer. The code for counsel and barrister, which was a word she used about the second set of lawyers, or second lawyer, is these people are expensive. And the second lawyer gave better advice, and she was duped by the first set of lawyers who gave her bad advice. This is the basic explanation. Not my fault. Classic strategy, not my fault. Blame the lawyers. The cheap lawyers. She didn't say they were cheap, but you can read between the lines. Okay, so the lawyers have defended themselves, by the way, since, and said we just gave advice depending on the information we were given. So there's a danger with the blaming other person strategy. Not my fault, it's that person over there. Because that person over there, if asked, will try to defend themselves. However, enough muddying of the waters has occurred by you saying, "Listen, I was just following advice," that it can deflect acrimony heading in your direction. So it's not a bad strategy to blame someone else. However, there is a deep problem here, which is that this is just not an ordinary person, and we all know the law is complicated, and buying and selling a house is a nightmare, and overly complicated by the lawyers. So blaming the lawyers is not a bad strategy, because we're not unsympathetic to the fact that it's a complicated situation and lawyers may give bad legal advice. It's often difficult to understand the legal predicament we're in. There's a basic flaw with this argument, which I'm intrigued that Angela Rayner's advisors and herself have not thought through, which is she is the Deputy Prime Minister. This is a very responsible role. And as housing minister as well, part of that role involves taking advice from people, okay, and asking for advice. In fact, that's practically is the role. You can't be everywhere and do everything. So you sit in your office, people come along, you say to them what's going on, they give you advice, and then you act on the advice. The ability to evaluate advice, to work out who's a good expert, who's giving good advice, and who isn't, is core to the job. So if she can't, in her private life, work out who's given good advice, who's given bad advice, and she has a tendency to get bad advice and act on it, I'm afraid this is a very ominous indicator for a basic job. There's a basic link between what she did or made a mistake overtaking advice and what she does in her daily job. Classically, Tony Blair tried to blame the lack of finding of weapons of mass destruction and therefore the whole start of the Iraq War, which led to the deaths of about 1 million people. He said the advice he was given was a bit rubbish. Well, again, he didn't seem to interrogate the advice, and it looked like, again, a classic problem, he was being given advice by his intelligence advisors, which is kind of the advice he wanted to hear. It looked like he wanted to go to war. And his basic job of interrogating the advice and trying to figure out whether it was good advice or bad advice, which is what his basic job is, seems to have slipped him by a bit. So there is a basic flaw with this defense that Angela Rayner is trying to mount, which is, it's not my fault, I had terrible lawyers. Well, your job is to evaluate whether the people you're talking to are any good or any bad. If you can't work out that your lawyers are terrible or cheap or whatever, then what are you doing in the day job? Are you making a similar error? And any ordinary member of the electorate is likely to think about that problem. It's not a morality problem now for Angela Rayner, given her defense. It's a competency problem. She has raised significant questions over her own basic competency to do the day job. The second problem with her defense is, why did she go to the expensive, better lawyer? She only went to the expensive, better lawyer relatively recently because the press had begun to sniff around the story and had begun to make allegations. Really? You are the Minister of Housing, and you can't work out that if you buy a place, a house or a flat, the press might be interested and might start sniffing around, and you can't think through that actually you have to do better due diligence than the average person and have an ironclad transaction where no one can find anything wrong. She does seem to have been somewhat sketchy in the way she went about this. And again, it raises deep competency questions about the Deputy Prime Minister, that she couldn't figure out that she had to be belt and braces on this, given she is the Minister of Housing and she's buying a place. And she might have to go and get advice from 10 lawyers to really make sure she was okay. By the way, that's a good point. If she really had gone to 10 different lawyers, in other words, she really bent over backwards to try and make sure she got the best advice possible, and after 10 lawyers, they all gave her bad advice, let's say, and she did the wrong thing, she's covered, because she really went beyond the average attempt to do due diligence, okay? So that's, again, mysterious as to why she couldn't work that out for herself, that this doesn't look good. Taking a step back, there's an even deeper problem with the interview. And it refers back to Keir Starmer and the fact that he's been caught kind of, I don't mean to be brutal here, but one way of thinking about this, and certainly the electorate will be thinking about it this way, with his own hands in the till. There was expensive football tickets, there was the loan of a flat, there was the loan of or gift of expensive clothes and glasses, etc., etc. So Labour has been in opposition and only been in power for about a year, but in opposition for almost a record period of time. Okay, so you'd have thought, having been in opposition for so long and just arriving in power, they've only been in power for a year, that you've got a lot of work to do. You're meant to be interested in making the world a better place, and you've been out of power for a long time, and now you're in power. Within a year, we've had at least 2 major possible scandals. And it's that length of time from power to scandal that is very interesting to a psychiatrist. Let me go back to my analogy of a woman finds dodgy text messages on the boyfriend's or the husband's phone. If you've just got married and you were courting for about a year, then you got married, and a month into the marriage, you find dodgy text messages, okay? That's a world of difference psychologically than you've been happily married for 30 years, you've been looking at the guy's phone for 30 years, nothing weird cropped up, and then in the 31st year or 42nd year of a perfectly faithful and happy marriage as far as you're aware, you suddenly find dodgy text messages. That's a whole different thing. It's the length of time from the start of something, a marriage, that you find the dodgy text messages. That is very worrying. If it's a very short time, and it is in the case of this Labour government, then that is worrying, because it goes to a deeper point, which is that in the 31st year of a marriage and you find dodgy text messages, maybe the man's character was basically good, but something happened and he started to stray. There was an event of some kind, or he got bored or depressed or something. I'm not excusing unfaithfulness, I'm just showing you. However, if within a few weeks of being married you find dodgy text messages, it suggests a more alarming possibility. You've got a basic character problem with the guy. And this goes to another deep problem, which is when you've got a character problem and you start to do due diligence, you find other misdemeanors in the past. And that's really the acid test of how to evaluate anyone's story. Someone can explain away an indiscretion, and as long as it's a one-off and they've not been constantly, rampantly being bad in some way, then maybe you can accept the explanation. But anytime something dodgy's occurred, look and do due diligence for past events to see if there were past examples of problems. And people tend to turn a blind eye to that. And the press, if they know their job, will be digging very deep now into the past of Angela Rayner to see if there are any repetitions of dodgy behavior in the past. You have to be an amateur psychologist, a good amateur psychologist, hopefully, in order to negotiate the hazards of life. People will tell you stories. They will tell you a story to try and excuse or explain away bad behavior, particularly when trust has got broken or called into question. You have to evaluate the story. This will happen to you on many occasions in your life, from small misdemeanors to big ones. And you've got to evaluate the story, think hard about what's going on. Are you being manipulated? And I've tried to use the Angela Rayner interview to give you some clues as to how to evaluate a story when people are telling you a story to try and explain their behavior. I hope you found that helpful. I want to emphasize again, I'm not saying the whole interview was pure strategy and Machiavellianism or manipulativeness. What I'm saying is you have to think about all these different possibilities, because if you don't think about them, they will slip under your radar, and I'm afraid you will get duped. The final point I want to make is that the Conservatives were kicked out, possibly you could argue because they were strongly linked with the idea of sleaze and having their snouts in the trough. The new people that have arrived look like they've got their snouts in the trough as well. That's the way it looks to the average person. So the thing is, I think the average voter is beginning to think very hard. We don't want the usual crew, the professional politicians, Labour or Conservative. And that's why new parties, I'm not saying I support the new parties in any sense, but psychologically, one of the reasons why the rise of completely new parties with no past history have a great chance, I think, right now, is precisely because these new politicians are amateurs. They're not professionals. And it's their very amateurishness that endears them, I think, actually, to voters, precisely because of the sleaze that has been attached to the older political characters on stage, the older characters who are professionals. I think this is the rise of the amateur, this era, and I think there's something about amateurishness that appears clean and sincere compared to the cynicism of the professional. And I think we're going to see the rise of the amateur politician as a result.